So I'll start off with, I think, the basic problem, which is it ever possible to rescue science from politics? As you all know, I don't need to tell you, the world is full of self-appointed defenders of the truth. But the world is also full, increasingly so, of promoters and salesmen. Now, there's a time, which I can remember certainly in my own lifetime, when it was thought that there were separate spheres. A sphere of science which somehow excluded politics, or at least rendered it relatively harmless, and a sphere of the political, thrust and fight of every day. But then science studies came along. And science studies has, in part, a number of the people that you mentioned, have made their name by saying that science is always and everywhere political. I think that actually is not very interesting either. And so my dissatisfaction is with both, and in a sense that's the purpose of today's talk, which is to discuss, and maybe even help inform you, a little bit more about actual currents of thought, I think, main currents of thought, about what is the relationship between science and politics that have proven to be very important in the 20th century. Okay. Now, but I don't want to forget about trust. And so here's what I see as the first problem of discussing trust in science, or at least in the modern world. That is, that why should we, the public, trust science when it becomes increasingly evident that scientists less and less trust each other? Okay, and that sounds like a huge generalization, hard to define, hard to prove, but in fact, there is a sort of a legal literature which shows that we can measure this. And of course, we all know that measurement is important to this issue. And the way we measure this is the rise of the material transfer agreement. And here, I'm going to make reference to some old-fashioned and probably out-of-fashion notions from 19th century social science that various forms evolved from status to contract, various social forms. And that is what is happening in modern science. Increasingly, scientists, in order to interact, particularly in order to share research tools, research materials, and so forth, don't simply do it on the basis of status. They do it on the basis of contract. And that contract is called a material transfer agreement. Now, I don't want to put half the audience to sleep here. I could spend a whole hour just on material transfer agreements. But all you need to know is it's a beautiful sign of how scientists in University A mistrusts scientists in University B. Because if you read these contracts, they're fully open-ended. They have, I mean, the number of clauses that could be included in them are, in fact, potentially infinite. It includes things like indemnification, which you would expect if you were worried about the other guy. You want a certain amount of insurance protection, legal protection, due diligence. But it also has all kinds of other things, like reach-through clauses. You guys probably don't know what this is. This is an attempt to claim the intellectual property of the other guy at the other university if he or she develops new intellectual property from using your research tool. Wow! That's new, and I mean that. That's going to be important in the talk. There are things that are new that didn't exist before. Now, we've already identified one of them, okay? Also, all kinds of shared liability clauses. I mean, really, these are so Baroque, it's amazing. But all you need to know is here is an index of a lack of trust between scientists, okay? And by the way, some of you could help me out a little bit. For 2 years, I've been trying to gather information on the amount of these things that are going on. And technology transfer officers really don't like to talk about these. You go and they'll tell you how many wonderful patents they got. They don't want to tell you how many material transfer agreements they've contracted in the last year. This is the little bit of data that I've been able to receive from these people, kind of kicking and screaming mostly. And All you need to know about this is there's actually supposed to be two numbers in each cell, although that's not necessarily the case in all of them. The first one is incoming MTAs. So that's other units saying, would you sign an agreement? So these incoming could be coming from corporations, for example, you see, and then they were trying to control, to a certain extent, the research of the university scientists. The things that universities are really embarrassed about are outgoing MTAs. Outgoing are universities pulling the trick on other universities. And many universities won't even report that number, which is why the second cell is empty, even though I have information on incoming, the first cell. What else do I want you to get out of this? This is a quantitative measure of a lack of trust, is it not? Because MTAs are growing at a rate of 15 to 20% a year in most American universities. That's a huge rate of growth. Do you realize down here at Stanford, we're talking about, and by the way, these are just incoming, we're talking about 3 to 4 MTAs coming in every business day? 3 to 4? And this is only the beginning. Now, I want to start talking about science studies, because some of you guys really like people like Bruno Latour and so forth, okay? So I want to get this out of the way, too, that for some people, they find the Latourian take on all of these issues as particularly radical. And he says something that's supposedly radical there. The division of things between progressivist and reactionary ought to be abandoned. And this is very similar to the kinds of arguments he often makes recently. My whole talk today is an argument against this. This is the dangerous dead end of science studies, I want to argue. But for those of you who don't care about science studies, I want to talk to you too. There are a number of things that we might feel at the moment about what's happening to science and the commercialization of science. A lot of people feel like they've got the rascals on the run this year. Got a different Congress, talking the United States. Stem cells research is expanding, more FDA oversight. Now it's true that these people, and I'm glad that you guys brought this up, repeatedly harken back to some golden age. It's very common, and I'm not going to say what the Mertonian norms are. They've already been mentioned, okay? They think they can bring back the Mertonian age, okay? They also think the modern regime can be reformed piecemeal. This is speaking to many of the possible speakers today. Let's disclose conflicts of interest in research, for example. Let's register drug trials in a serious way. Let's extend the Data Quality Act to corporations as well as academics. If you don't know what that means, don't worry about it, although that's a good example of, piecemeal reform. I also want to argue today that this idea of piecemeal reform is ineffectual once you understand the political theory behind the people who have built modern science, okay? So science and politics are very much intertwined. Now, forgive me if I get personal here just for a minute. About 10, 12 years ago, I, like everyone else, thought, okay, a little bit of commercialization, so what, And then out of the blue, I was commissioned by Scientific American, I was commissioned to write an article on Friedrich Hayek. And I showed this around to some of my friends. They said, isn't this weird? Why does Scientific American want an article on Friedrich Hayek, But, I'm just, hey, I'm willing to, help. And so I wrote something that was mildly critical, and I was paid for it handsomely, but it never appeared. It took me such a long time to understand what was going on with that transaction, but I think I understand now. There are two ways of understanding the politics of science, all right? And by the way, I am talking here from now on as a historian. That is, it's not my idea. It's that there are two relatively coherent ways of understanding the politics of science, both of which were generated in the 20th century, okay? And roughly, I'm actually going to run through them in the next few slides, if you don't mind, and then I'm going to come back to the issue of today. There's a left tradition that equates science with interventionist socialist politics. And let's not be afraid to say this, because it really self-consciously did. And I'm so glad you mentioned Bernal as well, because it's going to turn out that he was one of the earliest people to do this. Now, what does this mean? This means that the role of science is to bring rationality to an irrational society. That is the way these people wrote about this back then. And of course, if that were your goal, then you had to tie the social structure of science to the state. It was inevitable, all right? So this is the way that you would think about it. And also it presumed that science and democracy were mutually reinforcing phenomena, an issue that I will come back to, one of the weaknesses of this position. On the other hand, there's also a right-wing tradition, which, by the way, dates roughly to the same time period. You should also understand that both of these were generated as mirror images of each other starting in the 30s, all right? On the right tradition, what you get instead is that science is best understood and equated to market activity. Of course, if you believe that, you believe that the social structures of science should be tied to business in an ideal world. But also in this political theory, democracy is a threat to the operation of the market. Now, that may sound sort of inflammatory to you, but if we're talking political theory, I can easily trot out lots of these people who openly say this, okay? It is not me, it's them, all right? Now, if democracy threatens the market, democracy can also corrupt science, okay? And this becomes a problem for science, especially because truth naturally arises in market situations. Now, don't worry, you don't need to memorize it. This is just for the few people in the audience who actually want to know, who am I talking about here? There's actually a genealogy of this stuff. And one thing I do want you to get is it's not discipline-based. It actually it goes outside of many disciplines. So it's a larger project that starts off with Bernal, as it turns out. It's very importantly cited in philosophy of science in the post-war period, especially the logical empiricist movement. It also shows up in a left version of neoclassical economics. I'm also going to have to deal with that problem. There is no single economics here. If you think that that's true, economics tells us X. You don't understand anything, right? Economics has always been at war with itself. There's a left and a right wing here as well. And then finally, for the science studies folks, they should realize that British science studies, and particularly the Edinburgh School, has a direct relationship to this. Now, you may not care about the genealogy, but let me tell you the story quickly. When the military was manager-in-chief of science, roughly in the period from 1940 to 1980, this left discourse was the preferred discourse of the day. This is the way people talked about science, not only among academics, but also in general media as well. This was a commonly understood way of talking about science. Science here was treated as non-political, basic, non-market, inherently rational, remember, because it brings rationality to society. But the role of the military was always suppressed in this. This was always sort of the dark side of this whole story, because the military was paying for the science and was largely organizing the science during this period. There were some tensions in the story. I want you to understand that I am not coming here, advocating one and, running down the other. Both of these stories have tremendous internal tensions, it seems to me, which we are now playing out in the current situation. The essential tensions of this Cold War story was that it strived to reconcile the essence of science as planning with the pretense that scientific research could not itself be planned. That was an attempt to square a circle that never quite got there, all right? But that was the sort of life that you lived as a scientist under this particular regime. Also, you believed that science was some kind of ideal, autarkic, democratic polity, but then again, you believed it deserved unending public subsidy. Well, why should a self-governing, autarkic system deserve unstinting subsidy? You see, I mean, there's a fundamental lack of coherence here, which we just lived in this period. This one you probably don't care about, though, but I just want to signal to you people, whenever you hear somebody talking about science as a public good, they are talking this language. This language explicitly existed to develop the theory of the public good. That's the role of Arrow in all of this. And while I won't go through the yellow stuff, the bottom line was that the creator of knowledge was prevented from appropriating the full benefits of investment in research. That was sort of like the bottom line of the entire story. And so what does that mean? The state must I repeat, must subsidize gated communities buffered from politics. Hence, you begin to see where that separation comes from. It didn't naturally exist. It was a theory that created its possible existence. That's the way we should understand it. Also, I just want to put in a little plug for another historian, David Hounshaw, has a great little paper where he shows all of this stuff, which, by the way, never mentions the military, came out of Rand, and the early drafts of the paper all mentioned the real issue, which was weapons research. And then, of course, when it was finally published in the open literature, all the weapons defense stuff came out, and you just got the plain public good story. So this really is a Cold War story, isn't it? This is also the market failure rationale, okay? The idea that the reason you need to have the role of state-subsidized universities is because of market failure. It gave rise and underpinned a non-Marxian market socialism. See, people need to understand these subtle distinctions. This was not a Marxian theory. It was very much a Western neoclassical theory, but it was still thought to be a theory about socialism. So I'm not sneering. This is the term that they themselves would use. And then finally, a lot of you guys know about this whole linear model thing, right? That you pump the money into the universities, you get basic research, that leads to technological development, and so forth. Did you guys know that Vannevar Bush didn't even write that? That was ghosted by Paul Samuelson? Economists have been behind this from the beginning, this whole story, even though it wasn't obvious. All right, so that's the older story, but that's not the story we have now, okay? The story we have now happens with the collapse of that earlier story sometime around 1980. What's amazing about this collapse is it happens along many fronts of the story. It's not just one part and then the other part falls. And I also want to plump a wonderful paper, a monograph-length paper by Paul Foreman in History and Technology, where he shows that up until roughly 1980, everyone said, yeah, you got to have basic science to get applied. And then, almost overnight, everyone started saying, no, that's wrong. You got to have all this applied stuff, and that gives us the basic stuff. I mean, what an amazing switcheroo, huh? And this happens in intellectual history as well as the history of the reorganization of science itself. They go together. Today, no one believes the public good story. I hate to say that because a lot of people get kind of downcast because they still want to say public good, public good. No one believes the public good story anymore. Why not? Because there was another story which was developed simultaneously with the first story, which is now the dominant cultural story. Okay. As a historian, I just want to say, it comes from a place, we can do the history of it if you are interested. It actually comes, or two of the main places it comes from is the beginnings of the Mont Pelerin Society in 1947 and the development of a certain type of political economy at the University of Chicago in the post-war period. It includes a large number of economists, some of which you might have heard of, Milton Friedman, George Stigler. But, and this is the important part, early on it included philosophers and historians of science as well. From the very beginning, people like Michael Polanyi, who you may have heard of, Karl Popper, who you may have heard of, all attendees at Mont Pelerin meetings. Here's the genealogy of the story that people believe now. Again, a lot of you, you don't want to know the specifics, but there's the important names if you need to know them. Starting out with Hayek and Polanyi, coming down through Popper, Marketplace of Ideas. And by the way, notice to upset whatever few science studies people I have in the audience, I've got Bruno Latour down there too. We can talk about that later. Latour is a neoliberal. Now, what is neoliberalism? How can I explain it in 5 minutes? Neoliberalism is a theory that correct markets just don't happen. You have to make them. This is not John Stuart Mill, folks. This is not the night watchman state and the naturally occurring market. The kind of markets that you believe should exist have to be made, and you have to take power to make them. These people regularly write this sort of stuff, by the way. Moreover, it is constructivist, long before constructivism was ever important in science studies. They are some of the most constructivist people I know, actually. And for them, freedom is entirely negative. I don't have time to go into this, but this whole argument about negative versus positive freedom. You got to understand what freedom means here. Freedom is entirely a negative phenomenon. Negative in the sense that too much democracy can threaten their ideal. That's part of their theory. Now, what do you need to know about their tenets? Just a few things. Obviously, I can't do all of this here. The most important thing is it's a new image of the market. The market is no longer a simple allocation device for neoliberals. Instead, the market is the ideal information processor. You can think of it as a grand supercomputer. What the market does, first and foremost, is it transmits ideas. Notice this is going to be important for our understanding of science. Okay? Now, why are these people against socialism? It's easy to understand now, because no human being, and certainly no state functionary, can never understand as much about society as the market understands. And therefore, socialism is doomed. That's Hayek in 2 sentences. Okay? This is what they believe. This is not any other argument against socialism. I'm going to skip some of these, although the one that I do want to point out is that another neoliberal tenet is that the market can always provide solutions for problems seemingly caused by the market in the first place. This will become important when we come back and discuss science again. Now, what lessons would I want you to learn from this? First, neoliberalism is not identical with neoclassical economics. There's a left neoclassical economics and a right neoclassical economics. So you got to be careful. Economics doesn't tell us any single thing. Neoliberals are not libertarians. They believe in organization. They believe in taking over. They're kind of Leninist, actually. No, they've read Lenin. All right? So it's very muddy to think of this as state versus individual. I mean, it's much more complicated than that. And finally, even if you didn't care about all that other politics, the outcome of this theory is that the participation of lay people in science means anyone can buy the science they think they need and reject the science they don't like. That's how the world works for these people. All right? Think of all the implications of that for creationism, so forth and so on, and you begin to understand why this is a principled position on their part. They aren't just wackos. Now, a little bit of regular history, because I'm also an economic historian, among all kinds of other things. There are 5 trends that I just want to call your attention to. And again, I could spend an hour on this. These are all trends since 1980. One is the wide-scale deindustrialization of West. I hope I don't have to convince you of that. I come from the Midwest. I don't know where you come from. There's the great transformation of the regime of intellectual property, which many of you will hear about later in the conference. There is the restructuring of corporations, which has led, in a large way, to the outsourcing of R&D, corporate R&D, since the 1990s. That's actually very important for talking about the kind of things that we want to talk about in here. That's a big difference. It didn't exist before. There's the withdrawal of the state as science manager. Less and less the state does not want to be the manager. Doesn't want to fund it either, but doesn't want to be the manager. And then finally, there's the retreat of the state as the primary provider of education for the citizenry. That seems somewhat off the subject, but it's not. It is, what I want to convince you in the last part of the talk is that's part of it. These all go together. They aren't individually unrelated phenomena. The reason they are not individually unrelated phenomena is because each are informed by neoliberal doctrines. Deindustrialization follows from the neoliberal advocacy of the reduction of international trade barriers directly. The transnational fortification of intellectual property directly follows the neoliberal script for a privatized marketplace of ideas. Classical liberals didn't think that strong IP was a good thing. This is new. The re-engineering of the corporation is a neoliberal triumph too. I could spend an hour on that. Do you know that some of these guys used to talk about corporations as the last bastion of socialism and the heart of capitalism? That you had to transform the corporation as well? Hayek early on opposed any state funding or organization of science, and this is sort of interesting from a historical point of view. That's one of his earliest positions, and then neoliberals opposed the state provision of education. I hope you realize that Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Friedman has a whole chapter on what is the largest state sector in the economy that needs to be privatized. It's education. So each of these trends was explicitly called for within this conception. All right? They are not unrelated. So let me ask a question. How can corporations shed their R&D labs, as I just told you, and yet displace the state as the primary patron of science? This seems somewhat incongruous. No? How is it possible? It is possible because for the first time in history, and as a historian I am making that statement, for the first time in history, scientific research has been rendered fungible to such a degree that contract research can be safely and effectively outsourced to whomever is the low-cost producer. Let's call it a domestic university, let's call it a foreign university, let's call it a contract research organization, very fascinating modern phenomenon, or any other specialist firm. The research function has been spun off from the post-Chandlerian corporation. The data on this is actually very poor. I just want to warn you, if you guys use science and engineering indicators, all that data is just wrong, which attempts to get at this. I can't go into why. It's just wrong. A better set of data is a recent questionnaire which was given to corporate research officers in a large number of firms, asking where will your next R&D facility going to be? Notice the home country is the row and the source country is a column. I draw your attention to the upper left-hand cell. How do you interpret that? I interpret that as there is no corporate interest in having further research base in the United States, at least among Americans. Thank God for our Western European cousins is all I can say. Well, China doesn't have to thank God. Here's the point. The science base, the maintenance of a science base on a national level has lost all meaning, and consciously so under this way of thinking about how science is organized. Corporations don't care. They are offshoring their R&D to reduce their costs to follow the manufacturing that's already been offshored. You see, these things really are connected together. The state wants to offload its education burden, funding burden, and anyway, education doesn't exist to produce citizens anymore. People should just buy human capital. And if they can't afford it, well, tant pis. Strong intellectual property is having an interesting effect too. Knowledge is no longer tied to the national culture quite in the same way. And so the idea that you had to foster a national culture is actually, let's say, less pressing than it used to be. And of course, distance education can provide cheap credentials anywhere. But most importantly, neoliberals harbor deep suspicions about scientists, and as they have historically, as I've shown. Scientists need more market discipline, don't they? Don't they? What is this crap that they give us about, freely following their inclinations? I mean, who gets to talk like that, huh? How much time have I got? Sorry? No. What? Hey. What do you know? Okay, well, here's the major objective, just in case you didn't get it. Looking at the university and talking about scientific research in the university is deeply misleading, deeply so. Because what you do is you ignore all those other trends and the way that they interact. And in fact, I would like to suggest that the university did not initiate the modern trends towards the commercialization of science. As far as I'm concerned, there's no evidence that that's true, or very little. This all was initiated outside the university. The university is playing catch-up in a sort of befuddled way, trying to come to terms with this new world, which has room for universities, but not the kind that existed during the Cold War. The Cold War university, I would argue, cannot be reinstated. Cannot. We can't go back. Just like we can't go back to a manufacturing economy. How's it going to happen? Somebody convince me. The loss of trust in science is therefore, notice I came back to the topic. The loss of trust in science is both a consequence of and a reflection of this neoliberal ascendancy. Because trust is a synonym or a sort of a catchphrase for the dissolution of the whole left framework way of discussing science. That's how I understand this whole fascination with the loss of trust. Some people say to me in response to that, oh, come on, Mirowski, science has always been commercial. I swear, if I had $1 for every time somebody said that, you know? It's a pernicious error precisely because it has a grain of truth to it. Science has, of course, always bore some relationship to markets, of course. But to think that that format would be the same through history is a deep error. It's an error promulgated by neoliberal conceptions as the market as a trans-historical, trans-cultural, monolithic object. That's what's wrong with that story. And all along in this talk, I've been trying to convince you of ways of things that are new, that did not exist before, and play directly into the restructuring of science in the modern world. Okay. This could be anything from the configuration of academia to the state of property law to the status of the corporation. Notice, if you just look at the university, you miss a lot of this, basically. The modern era is different. For the first time in history, knowledge and research are treated as fungible across national boundaries, as I've just demonstrated. That's new. That didn't happen very much before. So, here's where the original globalization title came in. Globalization and neoliberal doctrine have redefined the very politics of science. They have done this by re-engineering how science is carried out. So, for example, the science-technology relation that I mentioned earlier has been reversed. Democracy is changed. What democracy means is changed. Universities are being undermined in various ways. I'll talk about that in a minute. Even publishing has changed for all of you who now, I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I don't own anything I've written anymore. I'm blocked from even putting it up on my own website. Geez, that's different. Peer review, another thing. Peer review was mentioned earlier. Peer review is being totally transformed and undermined under the new system. Now, there's still something there, but it doesn't look anything like the Cold War version of peer review. Very little like that. So that's part of the things that are changing, too. And then finally, something that I trust Sheila might talk about tonight, is that science as a political juridical arbiter has been dissolved because it's brought closer to an adversarial model. Don't you see? If you have to buy the science you like, and you buy your science and I buy my science, then this science is supposed to act as an arbiter in a political arena? It doesn't make sense. Hence, this may not be a popular point. It's not just a Republican war on science. That's incredibly parochial. Right. And it's the error of people like Chris Mooney, who wrote that book. Paul David is another guy who goes on and on about this. If you have to buy the science you like, and you buy your science and I buy my science, then this science is supposed to act as an arbiter in a political arena? It doesn't make sense. Hence, this may not be a popular point. It's not just a Republican war on science. That's incredibly parochial. And it's the error of people like Chris Mooney, who wrote that book. Paul David is another guy who goes on and on about this. The Cold War configuration was neither a natural nor optimal state. It's a mistake to talk about it that way. I already pointed out some of its problems and its tensions. All right. Merton does not describe the timeless nature of science, and never did. Merton didn't describe science in the Cold War seriously. I mean, sociologists want to. And Merton clearly does not describe it now. The neoliberal project is a long-term restructuring of the entire polity, and science is just one component. They didn't go after science. See, that's the trouble with this whole thing. No, they deindustrialized and freed up capital flows and privatized education. And hey, oh gosh, science had to change too. It's bringing up the rear. By the way, Democrats are equally complicit in this. Much of this happened under Clinton, not under Bush. But I will say that universities cannot persist in their current state. Maybe that would speak to a bunch of people here. Awkward attempts to appeal to a public good while scrambling to act like corporations, quite frankly, is not a politically viable strategy. I mean, it's amazing the hoops that university presidents jump through now. On the one hand, they are trying rapidly to attract this corporate outsourced money, but on the other hand, they say, oh, but we're doing it for the public good. See, that's why it's important to understand that these two languages don't map. This is incoherent pidgin. And it's going away. Take a look at any bioscience department. In your own universities, most bioscience departments actually offer courses, usually out of the business school, on attracting venture capital. But nobody is offered a course on the history, philosophy, and politics of science. That gives the game away. This isn't about thinking about what's going on. This is about bringing up the rear and learning to live in the new world. By the way, do you know the University of Illinois has attempted, it was going to have a new campus, all right? This is a recent phenomenon. So what they decided to do, and by the way, it was mostly administration, as you'll hear, to develop an entirely online or distance education campus. So, no buildings, that cuts the cost, right? Staffed only by gypsy unfaculty, get rid of tenure, which, by the way, is also going away and is not funny. Tenure is anti-neoliberal. Right? Somebody please tell me, why isn't this the future of state universities? Do you know most state universities in the United States only get between 15 and 25% of their total operating budget from their state now? Did you know that? I have seen the future, and it's this. And in particular, I can't resist this dig. Economists trumpeting the cornucopia of technology transfer are the enemy within. They really are. They are destroying the very institutions that nurtured the existence of their own discourse. But of course, they're also quick to take jobs in the private sector. I'm done. How the questions are changed. I can still remember, and this dates me, people would ask, why should private firms or individuals capture the benefits of research subsidized by the state, right? If you ask that question, you just show how stupid you are. Allowing the capture undermines the political support for state subsidy. That was the purpose of Bayh-Dole. Bayh-Dole wasn't to get our wonderful hidden findings out of the the ivy-covered buildings and into the world. It was a political project. It is a political document. Think of when it was passed, and that tells you one thing right there, what the composition of the Congress was when it was passed. Now critics instead ask, why should the state, via universities, inefficiently provide commodities that are better provided by market-oriented institutions? In other words, back to our theme, why trust those devious, self-interested academics anymore?